You join me on a very cold winter's morning. I thought there's a particular topic that I hadn't covered before, and that is the cooling system. So I'm going to quickly go over what you need to watch for and what could go wrong in the future. Really honestly, there isn't much to go wrong with a cooling system in a Mark 1 Focus, whether that be a petrol or diesel. They're all very similar systems and they're extremely well designed for all the engines. Quite a few cars in this time suffer from inadequate cooling because obviously you've got the extremes of manufacturers using more aluminium in their engines, and a lot of manufacturers didn't understand the actual contracting and expanding properties of aluminium. And if you haven't got a cooling system to match, then you're going to have some cooking issues later on. But in a Mark 1 Focus, the cooling system is more for an adequate size to keep the engine very, very cool indeed. In fact, I actually flushed this cooling system out 2 years ago. I did a bat flush. I did it as thoroughly as possible to remove all the old stuff. There really wasn't much that came out from the system. The aluminium block in these engines, which I will say now, the 1416, if you've got this engine with an aluminium block, you should see pink coolant in that reservoir. It should be nice and clean inside the block. If you take the water pump out and the thermostat, which we're going to come across in a second, that housing should be clear. It all should be clean. That literally aluminium block should be clean on the inside, and you'll see evidence of that. These blocks do not fur up, and my car used to run at around 98 degrees on the scanner. After I did the flush and new coolant, this car will barely get above 92 degrees, which is way below when the fan cuts in. I think it's like 100 degrees, something like that, or even more. I think more than that, actually, to be fair. Now, the cooling system in general, what you need to watch out for are thermostat leaks. Now, thermostat leaks on the 1.416 engine are quite rare, actually. It's not really a thermostat housing. If I take you down here, it's more of a sort of flange where you got the two pipes. So you got the one pipe that goes from the bottom of the radiator, and then this pipe that takes it along all the way to basically the back heater. So it will go all right across to the back heater, and it will come back via this pipe to the actual top radiator. This pipe, by the way, connects underneath the top radiator hose, connects underneath the coil pack, and then the heater hose comes in at the around about that underneath that hose also. But that's as simple as it gets for the cooling system. And you've got the expansion hoses here. You've got one here which takes it from the back of the engine, so you've got the expansion gases going back in. The only real failures of this system on the 1416 that I've been aware of is the thermostats. The thermostats, if they're the originals, they haven't been changed, they will go wrong. They do tend to stick shut, so they tend to stop. Basically, they can cause overheating issues where the coolant is not allowed to circulate through the radiators. It's just stuck in the block as such. So that is something to be very aware of. The expansion tanks are made of plastic and they can get brittle over time. This is a brand new one, by the way. I changed mine a few years ago because I noticed some cracks along the seam here, so just be aware of that. In terms of the hoses are very long-lived things. These will last a long time. I mean, I'm not joking you when I say this. The two heater hoses, the bottom and the top radiator hoses, the heater bypass hose, they are all the originals. I have not changed any of them on the car. They literally are all the originals. You can see the Ford Motorcraft emblems on them. And to be honest with you, I've seen so many Mark 1s in the scrapyard, besides whatever engine, and they mostly all have their original hoses, which is incredibly rare. In order to find in other cars. Usually most cars this age will have had a couple of hoses changed at least, because they do go. But I found that none of the hoses that I have suffer from any of the cracking issues, because they can actually crack where you actually got the clamp, and they can start kind of bulge, but there's no bulging that I can see on any of these hoses. I do give them a regular check over because they are, you know, they are 20 years old now, but it is not fairly it's fairly common to see Mark 1s at this age with all their original hoses. They're just very well made, and considering the cost from Ford of a genuine Ford bottom hose, for example, that would be, each hose I reckon is about £30 from what I've seen from Ford, unless you're lucky enough to get one that someone's bought and they've got rid of the car but they've still got the hose in the packet. Well, that's very lucky, because you probably get it at a better price. So realistically, there's not a lot to go wrong. Water pumps run off the belt, which is a fantastic design, because in a lot of other cars they run off the timing belt, and frequently if you leave the water pump too late and people don't change the water pump if they do the timing belt, because some people just skimp, that's not a good thing. Change the water pump, because what you don't want is the water pump seizing, and they can seize, the bearings can go funny in them, they can start leaking water out you've got like a bleed hole at the top, just a small bleed hole. If you see coolant coming out of that, you're in trouble. And like I said before, aftermarket water pumps, don't go for them. This is a Gates one, it's rubbish. It tends to just weep a little bit of coolant out the end. I don't know why, but there's nothing actually wrong with it apart from that. But I would say genuine water pump if you can get one, because the genuine ones can last 10 years, the lifetime of a timing belt basically. So I may have to change that before the next time belt change. We'll just see how it goes on. It's one of those things to just keep on and monitor. In terms of the heater, what we have down here, okay, in all the models, we have 3 hoses. We've got the top one, bottom one, I can't remember which one goes where, and we've got a third one there. Now that third one is a drain, okay, this one here, it's a drain. If you see any condensation coming out of that, if you have an air conditioning model, that's what it is. It's just a tiny drip of water. But if you're losing coolant and there's a constant drip coming out and the water tends not to, well, basically you'll see water on the subframe and it won't actually move, that's antifreeze coming out the system. Unfortunately, I have some bad news if that happens. The heater matrix in your car is leaking. Basically the heater matrix, I'll show you inside the car where it sits. It sits basically down here. This is the box, okay, where the heater matrix sits in. The drain hose sits right at the bottom of this box, and basically it's in case the heater matrix ever leaks, so it doesn't flood the cabin. And I've never known a Mark 1 to flood the cabin if the heater matrix starts leaking. It will always go to the bottom of this pan and go out that drain hole, that drain hose, okay. Now usually if you have a Mark 1 and your heater matrix is leaking, that is a sure sign that the system has not been looked after in terms of the correct OAT coolant. Don't put blue stuff in, don't put green stuff in, it's not meant for it. OAT coolant. Now OAT coolant has many properties, and that includes lubrication and cleaning purposes, because obviously in a lot of water pumps, even though these water pumps are metal, not plastic, OA2 coolant goes in a lot of cars with plastic impellers and plastic parts. It's a lubricant, it lubricates the hoses. And I really have this theory that the reason that Ford hoses last so long, not because they're just well built, but because if you maintain the OAT coolant levels, no tap water, no distilled, deionized is fine, don't use anything else. OAT coolant, please. The ready mix stuff is what I use because I can't be bothered to mix it. So yeah, that is the reason why your heater matrix is leaking, is because tap water's gone in, and basically tap water's really hard and it will just rust up the inside of the matrix. It could do the same to the radiator. If it's doing the same to that, it will do the same to that. Heater matrix failures were usually quite common about 7-8 years ago, when people start discovering that their cars were just leaking through the drain hole. and losing coolant. They couldn't work out where it actually came from. I'd put some of that down to manufacturer fault, personally. I think some of them weren't made particularly well, but if yours wasn't well made, you'd know about it by now. It's as simple as that. The other thing is, obviously, if you're not maintaining the system, you will get rust deposits, and that will usually be the heater matrix internally rusting. So that's the only other thing. But it won't leak into the car, but it will leak out that drain plug, that drain hose, and you'll be starting to lose coolant. I know what, occasionally this tends to drop a little bit because the water pump just weeps at the end, but that's it. Radiators don't really fur up, they just need a good back flush. What I'd recommend, if you're changing the coolant, I'd recommend flushing it, because most likely it hasn't been done. If you're doing it on a 1416, I suggest you take both these hoses out, okay, bottom radiator hose and the heater bypass hose, and take the thermostat housing out. It's held in by a few 8mm bolts. Be very careful when taking those bolts out. Be very gentle with a small 1/4 inch ratchet, something very small, okay, where you can actually feel what the bolt's doing. Penetrating fluid is possibly required, because those bolts go through steel, through plastic into aluminium, and steel bolts going into aluminium, you get the picture. So be very, very careful with those bolts, because I've heard of them shearing and someone had to scrap his engine because the bolts sheared in the block. After you've done that, I recommend taking the hoses out, taking the thermostat housing out, replace the thermostat. It's not expensive. Do not buy aftermarket ones, okay? There are a few, and there's a brand from Euro Car Parts. Do not buy that brand. I bought two, they were dodgy. I've got a genuine Ford 82-degree thermostat in there, which is the correct one for this car. I believe it's the same for all the petrol engines and possibly diesel. I might be wrong about that, actually, don't quote me on that. Change it, just change it. And then with the thermostat out the way, you can flush the block. You can literally flush the block out the back. Without that, with the thermostat in the way, you can't flush the block. You can only flush the radiator. It's no good. So I would recommend doing that. Now, on the 1.82 litre models, there is a very particular failure of the thermostat housing, mainly because the thermostat housing is right next to the coil pack, and it's a big thing with long bolts that go up the side. So it sits on the side with long bolts that go in, and quite frankly, the amount of plastic and the amount of vibration that it's subjected to, after 15 odd years, it's going to crack. They always crack, and then they just whip down the block, and you end up with loads of puddles of coolant, usually where it catches on the webbing of the gearbox. And you will notice the coolant level go down unless you're driving along, and then it goes into the red zone. In that case, stop immediately, really honestly. But that's really the only failure on a 1.82 litre in particular. They're not really known for going on these cars, but it's not really a housing, it's more of a flange on these cars that the thermostat sits on. And they're not really known for failures. I'm on the original still. It doesn't leak. There are two seals on it, doesn't leak at all. And I've had no issues with that whatsoever. And I had no issues putting it back on, despite the fact that I went through the trouble changing the thermostat. On the 1.82 litre models, you've got a cast iron block, okay? They can fur up. Because of the nature of cast iron, they can fur up, and it is not uncommon to see brown tinted OAT coolant in the reservoir. Don't panic, just give it a good flush, and that might improve the colour of the fluid. Unlike an all aluminium engine, it is not a clean engine. It will fur up, you won't get pink bottle. Very rarely have I seen a 1.82 litre with a pink coolant bottle. They do tend to fur up, so don't worry about it too much. Just if you can flush it through in the nearest opportunity and put new coolant in, you'll be all good. As far as bleeding the system is concerned, there are no bleeding ports on this engine, any of the engines, to be honest with you. There's no bleeding ports. It is a self-bleeding system, and they bleed extremely well. I know some cars struggle with that, because some cars have got the actual expansion tank. I don't know why they do this, but some cars have the expansion tank lower than the point of the radiator, and that's a problem, because that expansion tank is supposed to be the highest point in the system for air to come up and escape, and that's the idea. But some cars are not so good, but this is a brilliant car. You literally just fill it with, as soon as you put your hoses back on, put everything back together, fill it with coolant. Obviously fill it gently, don't literally gargle it in, fill it slowly, okay? That will help the car. What you do then, once the coolant bottle is just, I'd fill it over the max because it's going to drop, so fill it to the brim. Take the cap off, start the car, and then you just run the car until it gets to temperature and the fan kicks in. When the fan kicks in, turn the engine off, turn it off. That level will have dropped, okay? So you may have to top up halfway through doing that procedure, but as soon as the fan cuts in, turn it off. Leave it. You can leave it with the cap off. It doesn't really matter. You can put the cap back on or leave it off. Leave it for a good 6 hours or overnight, and then the level will settle. All the air would have been burped out virtually. Top it up and off you go. You may need to check again after a couple of journeys, but that is how simple the system is. I've never heard of problems with this system. I've never heard of people having to squeeze the hoses. Usually you have to do that on some cars. You don't need to squeeze the hoses. And there's no other reason for an airlock other than for this, basically. The thermostats do not cause airlocks wherever they go wrong. And these engines are not known for that. If you want to test the engine cooling fan, now I've only got a single one because I don't have air conditioning, which I'm going to cover in a second. But if you want to test the fans or what the engine cooling fan, just go in the middle, take this grommet up, and what you're going to have to do is take this HT lead out and get a pick in to get the plug off the engine cooling, the engine temperature sensor. There's no coolant sensor on this engine, and same for the 182 litre. You've just got a temperature sensor, engine temperature sensor, which is what your gauge goes off. Now, basically that sends a signal to the ECU to tell it the temperature of the engine. Then the ECU controls your gauge. That gauge does not run off a separate sensor, unlike some cars where they've got an engine sensor for the ECU and another sensor for the gauge. Like my Project Beatrix, it's got two sensors on the coolant elbow, one for the ECU, one for the gauge. It's as simple as that. But this, no, the ECU controls your gauge in the car, so you know what it's up to, basically. But if you pull that out, the fan should turn on straight away. If the ignition's on, the fan will come straight up. Simple as that. And you'll know if your fan's working or not. On the air conditioned models, there's not really too many differences. Obviously, where I've got no air conditioner, I've got the power steering, that would normally be on the back, and the aircon compressor sits at the front. They don't usually go wrong. They're very sturdy things. The only things that can go wrong are some of the seals in the system. A good garage will be able to sort you out if you go for an aircon regas, to be honest. There will be an air dryer down there. Now, I have seen a few times the air dryer brackets tend to rust out and the air dryer is hanging off. They tend to be pretty bad, those hangers, for rusting. So check the air dryer bracket. Well, apart from that, you have a condenser at the front. They can sometimes, if you're someone who tends to enjoy going over speed bumps very fast, you can take the bottom of the condenser out. I've known them to get weak and fall off, or literally just shake themselves off. It's not a hard job to replace the condenser. Bit fiddly at the front, but honestly, it's not too much of a faff. In terms of the heating system, it's slightly different on the air conditioned models. You've got a different heater matrix, you've got a different fan setup. There's a load of different things on the air conditioned models, some of which I don't know too much myself because I don't have an aircon model, so I think that's something to be very aware of. But literally, there is one big question that people ask all the time, and that is, can I convert my manual heating system to an automatic climate control system? You can, but you're going to have to replace the heater matrix, the wiring. You're going to have to get the switches, obviously. There's so many things to change If you've got manual heating, stick with manual heating. Some people have done it, but honest to God, they've had to buy another car to just get all the parts and know where everything fits, because there's that many components. Not even I can tell you exactly how many things you've got to fit. You've got to fit all these the temperature sensors as well. There'll be one in the dash, one on the front of the car. It's a completely different loom. Don't bother. Honestly, it's stupid. Well, there's two things I completely forgot. One, the radiator caps. Just check that they hold pressure. They're meant to up the pressure up to about 15 bar. That is the rated pressure for the system. So if you're using one of those coolant pressure tester things, you can pump it up to 15 bar when it's cold, and it should hold. It will no doubt hold. Any leaks will be exposed. The gauge will not hold if there's any leaks in the system. There shouldn't be any leaks. There is a way of testing pressure caps, but I would suggest that every so often, I would probably change the cap if it's the original. As a matter of course, you can get original ones. Don't buy aftermarket radiator caps. Get the original ones. They last, quite a long time, to be honest. I've got a few second-hand ones, but I prefer to get a brand new one. Secondly, also, I did not mention anything about head gaskets. These engines do not blow head gaskets. The cooling systems are extremely efficient in all the engines, petrol or diesel. The only reason to blow a head gasket is somebody has not maintained the car, not checked the coolant levels, not opened the bonnet every so often, and it's their fault because they kept driving when the gauge obviously went in red. You'd have to drive the car when the gauge is showing in the red, and that's the ECU controlling that gauge. As I said before, it would put it into the red, the fans would kick in, there'd be all sorts of issues, all sorts of telltale signs, and if you keep driving it, it will blow a head gasket like any other car. So it's down to user error there. So yeah, there's really not much to be said for these cars. There's very little to go wrong, so I'm gonna get back in. If I have missed something, no doubt somebody will pick me up on it, but they're that simple and that reliable, these cooling systems. Just change the cooling, the OAT coolant for proper stuff, high strength, flush it out, new thermostat, check the hoses, you're good to go for many years, no problems. It's never given me any issues, touch wood. Take care guys, see you very soon. Oh my hands, toasty hot. Woo! Woo!